Our final presentation is Give Me Austerity and Fiscal Discipline, but Not Yet, by Klaas and Veld. And we have predicted for Klaas that there will be lots of questions for him, because of course this is a really, speaking of compelling topics for us all. Klaas is Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Wyoming, where he has been for 8 years. His research focuses on energy and the environment. He is a native of Holland, actually, and he spent a lot of growing up years in Kenya. He has an interesting background. His undergraduate background was from the University of London. He has graduate degrees, both master's degrees and PhD or doctoral degrees from the University of California at Berkeley. And he also was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Michigan, where he was for 7 years, and he also directed the honors program there. So we welcome Klaas and look forward to your questions afterwards.
Needed that first. I'm glad you introduced me and told everyone that my specialty is not what I'm going to be talking about today. I should warn you about that. I'm going to be giving you a lecture on what's known as macroeconomics, the economics of the nation as a whole, as opposed to microeconomics, which is the economics of an individual market or an individual industry. My specialty is neither. I am an environmental economist, as in fact are many people at the economics department at UW. And so I just want to, as a caveat up front, warn you that even though I have studied macroeconomics at the PhD level, I did not then go on to become a macroeconomist, and so I don't spend every waking hour thinking about what the deficit of France in 1948 was. So I'm not a Paul Krugman or a Greg Mankiw who just can give you snap answers to any of the questions that might come up. On the other hand, I hope to convince you at the end of this lecture that fundamentally, macroeconomics is really simple. And hopefully we'll be able to figure out some of the questions I might not have answers to together. So with that, the title of my talk was actually an idea of Paul's. I'm an economist, so I'm not funny. He came up with this idea after I kind of explained to him what I wanted to talk about. He said it reminded him of this famous prayer of St. Augustine, give me chastity and continence, but not yet, because he prayed this when he was still young, when he still wanted a little bit of immorality to go forward. And you could say that the analogous prayer of economist right now would be, give me austerity and fiscal discipline, but not yet, because we're still in a deep recession. So that's the basic message I want to convey today. And just to get a lay of the land, let me just ask with a show of hands this question here. The Obama administration spent $787 billion on a stimulus package past February 2009. Now it has been spent. Do you, on balance, would you say that that stimulus package ended up helping the economy, basically having no effect, or basically hurting the economy? So show of hands, who would vote A, it mostly helped the economy? Who would say B, basically had no effect? Who would say C, mostly hurt the economy? Okay, and one more. More generally, in times of high employment, which we still very much are in, the latest statistics I've seen are 4 people are looking for every job out there, whereas normally it's more like 1.1, 1.2. Do you think that the government should increase the deficit, keep the deficit stable, or cut the deficit? So who would say, show of hands, it should increase the deficit? Who says it should keep the deficit stable, balance the budget? Who said it should cut the deficit? Okay, good. So that sets the scene. What I want to start out with is, this is a page from a textbook by Greg Mankiw, who is a very highly respected conservative economist. He was chief of the Council of Economic Advisors under the first Bush Jr. administration for 2 years, a Harvard economist. And this is a page from, or a table from his textbook, Essentials of Economics, which is I think it is the most used introductory economics, macroeconomics, microeconomics textbook out there. And what it shows is a whole list of statements that based on 2 surveys of a lot of economists, he says the vast majority of economists agree on, even though politically they're extremely controversial. Politicians disagree violently on every single one of these statements. But it turns out if you ask economists from both sides of the aisle politically, they all agree, pretty much. And I want to draw your attention in particular to 3 of these statements. Fiscal policy, for example, the tax cut and or a government expenditure increase, right, both of which would increase the deficit, has a significant stimulative impact on a less than fully employed economy. 90% of economists would agree with this statement. In other words, they would vote A on that question that I just showed you. If we're in a situation with very high unemployment, the government should increase the deficit. On the other hand, statement 7, 83% of economists agree that a large federal budget deficit has an adverse effect on the economy. So how does that go together with that 4th statement? Well, it turns out that 85% of economists agree that if the federal budget is to be balanced, it should be done over the business cycle rather than yearly. And so you should, if the economy is in deep recession like right now, you should increase the deficit. Once it comes out of the recession and we have a boom, that's the right time to cut the deficit. And so over the course of the business cycle, you balance the budget because you don't want to have a long-run deficit. But in the short run, a deficit can be a good thing. So that's how those 3 statements are actually completely internally consistent. So that's my first take-home message that I hope you'll take home with you today. Exactly that statement I just gave you. Governments should run deficits during economic recessions, surpluses during economic booms. In other words, balance the budget over the business cycle. But I also want to touch upon a more general take-home message, which is that the economy, by which I very much mean the national economy, the economy of the country as a whole, right, the macroeconomy, is not like a household, is not like a corporation, and is not a morality play. Now, why do I say that? Because I follow the news, and I would argue that pretty much every single time a politician, Democrat or Republican, opens their mouths, they make this mistake. And usually they make both or all 3 of them at the same time, right? Comparing the economy to a household or to a corporation or treating it as a morality play, an issue of you need to be punished if you weren't frugal or the opposite, okay? The thing I want to very much convince you of is when you get to the national economy is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just a collection of households and a collection of corporations that is still essentially the same, just a little bit bigger. It's qualitatively different in a way that matters very much. Now, to convince you of this, I need to introduce the most basic concept of macroeconomics, which is the concept of the circular flow. Every textbook on macroeconomics starts with this. And basically what I'll be doing today is the very first undergraduate lecture in macroeconomics, all in pictures. It's no math. And this is, I would argue, this is the lecture that every politician who stands for national office should take. That should be a constitutional amendment, and then we would have a much happier country. So let me show you why. Fundamentally, the national economy is basically a collection of households and firms. Households supply labor to firms, right? The black arrow. Let me actually get my pointer here, because I might need to point at stuff. Is this going to work? Yeah, good. And firms supply goods to households. And this is known as the circular flow of the real economy, right? Real as in this is the stuff we care about. We care about labor, the sweat of our brow, right? That's real stuff. And we care about the goods that we get to consume. That's the real stuff. Contrary to what most people think, and every student that I get in my class thinks, economists don't give a fig about money. That's not what economics is about. Economics is about this stuff: labor, goods, real stuff. Money is just pieces of paper with a symbol on it that we pass around. You can't eat it, right? Money is useful, though, to measure stuff, and that's the only sense in which economists care about money. It's useful to measure these real flows that ultimately we only care about in terms of money. And so, oops, I need to do this, I guess, yes. And so, in order to measure the flow of labor, we put dollar figures on it, and we count the sum of all incomes that firms pass on back to households in return for the labor. And in order to measure the flow of goods from firms to households, we measure the sum of expenditure that households send to firms in exchange. Right? Goods go from firms to households, that's what we really care about, but we measure it by looking at how much money people spend on those goods. And so this is known as the circular flow of the money economy. Goods and labor go this way, money goes that way. And when you read about the term gross domestic product is just either the sum of all those incomes, so basically how fat this arrow here is, that's one way of measuring it, or the sum of all expenditures, so how fat this arrow is right here. That's gross domestic product. Now, in reality, of course, households, this is too simple, right? Households don't spend all of their income. The economy also has a financial sector, which I'm just going to call banks here. And households send some of their income as savings to those banks. Now, from now on, I'm going to build up this picture now and complicate it a little bit. From now on, I'm going to distinguish between what economists call injections into the macroeconomy, into the circular flow, by using blue arrows. So anything that is a blue arrow adds to the circular flow. And consumption is an injection. The other one, red arrows are going to denote leakages. So this is, savings are a leakage. They take away from the flow, right? Suppose everybody, just for the sake of argument, suddenly stopped consuming and saved all their income. Nothing would be going around anymore, right? There would be firms would not be getting any money, so they wouldn't be able to hire anyone. The whole economy would grind to a halt. So savings are a leakage. They detract from the circular flow. That's the way to think about it. Now, banks, of course, don't just sit on those savings deposits normally, right? What they do is they take those savings deposits and lend them out to fund investment. And investment is another injection, right? Investment adds to the circular flow. Then there's the government. And the government taxes households. That's another leakage. If the government came in and taxed all our incomes away, the economy would grind to a halt, right? But again, the government, of course, doesn't just sit on the taxes. It buys things with those taxes. All the goodies that we like to get from the government, right? The highways and the military and infrastructure. So government purchases are another injection. And then finally, we have other countries. Money we spend on imports from other countries are a leakage, right? Because this money that comes out of households' income that we spend on imports is money that isn't spent on our firms, right? It's spent on other people's firms, other countries' firms. And so that's a leakage out of the economy. If everybody started spending all their money on imports, our economy would grind to a halt. On the other hand, money that other countries spend on our exports are an injection. That's money that's spent on our firms that keeps our economy moving, or helps our economy move. And once again, GDP can be measured either as the sum of all incomes, so still just how fat this arrow here is, or as the sum of all expenditures or injections. So as the sum of consumption, investment, and government purchases, plus, and here it gets a little bit screwy or hard to get your head around, exports net of imports. That's how we think about it. If these were exactly in balance, imports and exports would balance, we wouldn't have a trade deficit or a trade surplus, then they would have no net effect on the economy, right? So that's the third component of GDP when we measure it through the expenditure approach. So there's these two approaches to measuring GDP, the income approach and the expenditure approach. And just to give you a sense of magnitudes, consumption in the US right now is roughly, it changes a little bit from year to year, 70% of the total. So this is the big gorilla that drives the economy, consumption. Investment is only about 15%. Government purchases are about 19%. And then here's where it gets screwy. Exports minus imports are a negative number, right, to make this add up to 100, because we've been running trade deficits. So we're subtracting more imports than we're adding exports. So that's how that ends up being a small negative number. But the thing to notice is our country is so big that really this plays a very small role in our economy. Almost all of it is consumption with a little bit of investment and a little bit of government purchases. Trade doesn't matter very much because we're such a big country. If this were Holland, my native country, this would be a huge part of the economy and we'd have to worry about it. Here we don't, essentially. Now, what I've done here is I've tried to make my arrows here roughly comparable to those magnitudes I just showed you, right? So the big fat arrow is consumption. And then there's a little bit of investment, a skinny arrow, a little bit of government purchases, skinny arrow, and then the imports and exports. Now, what is a recession? A recession is basically when consumption contracts for whatever reason. So, whoops, this big fat arrow becomes a skinnier arrow. That's a recession. Usually, that happens because of some sort of shock, such as most usually a financial crisis, right? Think of the last three major recessions we had. The Reagan recession. The Reagan recession actually was a counterexample because that was actually purposely introduced to try and bring inflation down, so that's a different example. The Bush Senior recession, early 90s, came after the savings and loan crisis, right? The first Bush Junior recession came after the dot-com bubble burst. And this very deep recession that we're in right now came after the housing bubble burst. So typically the shock that prompts a recession is a financial crisis, and it just freaks consumers out. Think of it that way. Suddenly the world has changed, and now I'm really worried. I don't want to spend because I'm not sure that I'm going to keep my job. What's happening, right? Banks are no longer lending. The world suddenly is not going as smoothly anymore as I thought it would. So consumption contracts. Now what happens then? If consumption contracts, right, if people aren't buying as much anymore because they're too worried to buy, and instead they try to save, firms aren't selling. And so you're not going to be investing in a new shopping center or new machines if you don't think there's going to be the customers to buy that. And so typically investment shrinks as well. You can barely see it. The investment arrow shrinks here as well, right? And if it's a worldwide recession, like the one we're in right now, exports may shrink as well. So all these arrows shrink. But that's not the end of it, right? Think circular flow. If all these arrows are skinnier now, that means less money is coming into firms, right? There's less expenditure on goods that firms produce. That means they can't be spending as much on incomes that they send to households. They'd be running losses. And so what they need to do is lay off people, and household incomes therefore shrink as well. Whoops. They should be shrinking. Oh, there it goes. See? There it shrinks. I'm just getting my timing off here. In your family, maybe, that's going to make you even more worried about spending and even more preferring to save instead, right, for a rainy day. Things might go wrong. And so the next round, consumption shrinks even further. And as a result, investment shrinks even further. Because again, businesses are selling even less. Exports might shrink too, resulting in more layoffs. And so the circular flow basically becomes a vicious cycle. It starts feeding on it. This process starts feeding on itself where the economy starts shrinking, and the more it shrinks, the more it shrinks. A vicious cycle. Here's a question for you. See if you were paying attention. What do you think happens to the leakages? So For example, taxes. What do you think happens in a recession to the taxes? They shrink as well, right? Because typically taxes are just a fixed proportion of income. So if incomes are shrinking, tax revenue is going to shrink too. Tax revenue plummets. It becomes a really skinny arrow here. What about imports? Shrink too, right? If you're worried about spending, you're also going to be worried about spending on that iPad, right? So imports shrink. Eventually, it might take a while. What about savings? Not necessarily, exactly. Because consumers want to save more, right? That's what gets the whole recession going, in a sense. They get worried because of this financial crisis, and now they want to save more. But at the same time, their income has shrunk. And so they may not manage to save more. And so, in reality, it's not guaranteed that savings fall. And this is known in macroeconomics as the paradox of thrift. The very act of trying to save more, because we're in this circular flow economy, might actually cause incomes to shrink so much that you end up saving less. That's the paradox of thrift. And this is my first example of something that would not happen at a household level, right? This is because we're in a circular flow national economy, where savings affect incomes and therefore feed back to savings again. A fundamental difference when you talk about a national economy. Now, generally though, look at the arrows again. We've got savings going into banks, but a much skinnier arrow of investment going out. So savings will generally pile up at banks uninvested. And that's exactly what's happening right now still. Banks are sitting on huge reserves and not lending those out. Meanwhile, the government is running a deficit. We've got a really skinny tax arrow coming in, and I haven't done anything about government purchases yet. So purchases exceed revenues, so the government is running a deficit. And that's the $787 billion question. What do you think the government should do? Anyone? Not what European countries are doing, right? What have European countries done in response to the global recession? They have decided to go for austerity. They've shrunk government purchases and increased taxes. What is that going to do? Increasing taxes increases a leakage from the economy, makes it shrink more. Reducing government purchases reduces an injection into the economy, makes the economy shrink more. Guess what's happened in Europe if you've been following the news? Things are getting worse. They're going back into they're now in a second recession. They were starting to climb out gradually, but most countries in the Eurozone are now going back into recession because that's what you would expect to happen and what economists have been telling them all the time will happen. So macroeconomists say, no, you should do exactly the opposite. You should run a bigger deficit, big fat arrow, inject into the economy. And in fact, you should inject more the bigger the recession is. And since we have a huge recession going on right now, that should be a really fat arrow. So what will happen? If the government increases deficit spending, right, starts spending on, let's build those highways, and let's repair those highways, let's repair those bridges, let's use this as an opportunity to buy, say, internet access for public schools, or do more job training, or R&D, or alternative energy sources, all that good stuff, right? That puts firms back to work. Now they have to produce all that stuff that the government is demanding from them. And so what that's going to do is put firms back to work. That means they have to pay their workers, and the income arrow will get fatter. Households earn more income. Hopefully that will get them to start spending again. If households start spending again, investment will pick up again. Now, I haven't talked about tax cuts yet, right? I've just talked about government expenditure increasing. What if instead of increasing spending, we cut taxes? Let's go all the way, just get rid of them. Okay? That may help too, but can you see what the potential problem is? The problem is that households may just respond because they're still worried, right? If we're not back to normal yet, they may just respond by saving much of those tax cuts. And so we just replace then one leakage, taxes, by another bigger leakage, savings. right? We've just exchanged one leakage for another. And so economists typically say it's government purchases give you more bang for the buck. If you're going to run a deficit, run it through spending, because if the government spends $1, that's a full dollar of injection. If it's $1 of tax cuts, it just depends on how much the consumer decides to save rather than consume. So hopefully this injection by the government makes the vicious circle turn into a virtuous cycle, with consumption increasing further, investment increasing further, maybe net exports increasing further if the world as a whole is doing this, until eventually we were back to normal. Right? Now we're back to the same errors that we had at the beginning. At that point, the government can cut spending, raise taxes, and get back to budget balance. Right? Same size arrow coming in as coming out. The government is no longer running a deficit. It's in budget balance. Now, sooner or later, unfortunately, the way the economy works, at some later point, consumers tend to overshoot, right? Start spending too much or desiring to spend too much. Now, if we're really in an economy where firms are just running at full blast, at full capacity, making as much as they can with the labor available, everybody's employed, if consumers want to spend more, there's just not the goods for them, the real goods for them to actually be able to buy more. And so what's going to happen? If consumers want to spend more, but there's not enough goods to go around? Inflation, right? You'll just drive up prices, so you'll get inflation. And so that is, they'll start saving too little, causing the economy to overheat, threatening inflation. That is a great time for government austerity, right? Because now you want to cool down the circular flow. And so that is a great time to cut government spending and raise taxes, to leak some of out of that overheating economy, which will generate a government surplus, a budget surplus, and allow you to pay down the government debt that you incurred during the recession. Over the course of the recession and the boom, you will balance your budget, but in the meantime, you'll have kept the economy humming along. So that's my first take-home message. Government should run deficits during economic recessions, surpluses during economic booms, balance their budget over the business cycle. Now, what about that second take-home message? This notion that the national economy is not like a household, not like a corporation, and not a morality play. It's kind of, sort of, in the circular flow story, right? I hope you get a little bit of a sense that there's something different going on where you're looking at the economy as a whole, different from when you're just thinking about your own household budget. But in order to really drive that home, I decided I'm going to try and retell the circular flow story in a slightly different way that tries to make the national economy look as much as I can like a household and like a morality play. And hopefully by making it very close to a household and a morality play, you'll see the key differences more closely. And it also tells the circular flow story in a slightly different way, as you see in a minute, that gets a little bit more clearly into this whole issue of what's happening on the money side, what's happening to debt, which is kind of hidden in the background in the circular flow story. So here's my morality play, or non-morality play. Act 1. Meet Mabel, Sally, and Bob. Okay? Mabel likes managing Sally and Bob. That's how she gets her name, Ma. You can think of her as the mom, or maybe the older sister of 3 kids in a household. She likes managing them, have Sally and Bob work for her, to make stuff. So think of this as a household. It's kind of an odd household that is completely self-sufficient. It makes all the stuff that it uses. It grows its own food, it makes its own pencils, it makes everything, furniture, right? So this is a household that's completely self-sufficient. Mabel, Sally, and Bob make everything. So Sally and Bob send labor to Mabel, and Mabel sends goods back to Sally and Bob. So we've got a nice circular flow going on. In return for the labor that they supply, Mabel pays them wages, their monthly allowance. So there's an income flow from Mabel to Sally and Bob. And to do that, she's just made up these, she just used the Monopoly dollars from the game that they have. Just little pieces of paper with a little symbol on them. Here's your dollars, here's your wages. And when they get those dollars, they use those dollars to buy goods. So they send the dollars back to Mabel. And so we've got a nice circular money flow going on as well here. But notice, right, let's say we've got 100 Monopoly dollars, and that's what they're doing. They're just going around. Mabel is handing them over to Bob, Bob's handing them back. Handing them to Sally, Sally's handing them back. It's just money that's changing hands. Nothing real to it. Now, here, this little symbol here, keep paying attention to that. That's my little symbol to indicate we've got a happy circular flow going on. Everything's fine. Now I'm going to mess with stuff. Sally and Bob actually are different. Sally is frugal. She's one of those kids, you may have been one of those yourself, or your younger brother or sister may have been like that just loves saving, right? She gets her allowance, but she doesn't want to spend it. She just loves putting it in her piggy bank and every so often opening it and looking, oh man, I've saved up all this money. She's frugal. So she doesn't spend her whole allowance. She sends a narrower arrow of expenditure back than the income arrow that she gets from her work for Mabel. Bob is a spendthrift. You know those kids too, right? They can't wait for their allowance because they've already planned to spend it all. So his expenditure arrow, his desired expenditure arrow, is fatter than his income arrow. And this is the reality of every national economy, right? There's people that want to spend more than their income. There's people that want to spend less. And it could just be a matter of preferences. Some people just naturally like to save. Some people are naturally spendthrifts. That's how I'm telling the story here. It could be just the stage of your life that you're in. If you're young, you might be Bob. If you're in the prime of your life, in your 40s, 50s, 60s, you're earning so much that you might want to save. And then when you retire, typically you'll go back to being Bob again because you won't have much income, but you will still keep up your expenditure. So there are these two groups in society. So Sally ends up saving. That's the mnemonic here. Sally saves. And lending her money to Bob. Right? Rather than just sitting on all those dollars, she lends them to Bob. And now we've got a little circular flow going on again. Because the income she gets for her work, some of it she sends back to Mabel as expenditure, some of it she sends to Bob as loans. And so those add up. And similarly for Bob, some of the income, and all of his income, in addition to the loans, add up to the expenditure. So everything works fine. These Monopoly dollars are just going around and around. In return for the loans, Bob borrows, right? That's the mnemonic here. Sally's the saver, Bob is the borrower. In return for the loans, Bob sends IOUs to Sally. Just pieces of paper, not the Monopoly dollars, different pieces of paper that say, Sally, I'm going to pay you back. Right, I got $5 from you this month. I promise I'll pay you back. So this keeps going for a while. We've got a circular flow, right? There's nothing wrong here. All these IOUs piling up. Until one day, Sally has what economists call a Minsky moment, after the economist Hyman Minsky, blanking on his first name. A Minsky moment is when Sally suddenly realizes she's never going to get repaid. She's lent so much to Bob, and he kept promising, oh yeah, I'll pay you back, right? No problem at all. She suddenly realized, no, he's never going to be able to repay this. Mortgage crisis, right? That's exactly what happened. Happily selling away all these people buying subprime mortgages, and suddenly the banks realized, whoa, we thought these were safe securities, but they aren't. That was the Minsky moment of 2007. So panicking, as the financial system did at that point, Sally stopped lending. And we don't have a circular flow anymore here. The household has a financial crisis. Bob has to cut back spending. Right? So his expenditure arrow, notice, has to be cut and start repaying Sally. Now, if this were a regular household, that would be the end of it, right? Sally would just be repaying, or Bob would just be repaying Sally, cutting his expenditure, and eventually his debt would be paid off. Why is that not the end of the story here? Can you see? look at the hint is the red circles, right? We don't have a circular flow going on here. Bob is sending only this much money to Mabel because he's had to cut spending. Sally still doesn't want to spend a lot. She's still frugal, right? So she's sending her usual skinny expenditure arrow to Mabel. So Mabel can't be sending fat arrows of monopoly dollars back to Sally and Bob, right? If she's not getting the income, the expenditure coming in, she can't be sending out the income. And so, with Bob now spending less, Mabel has to cut hiring. The income arrows have to shrink, and now Mabel is back in balance. But then Bob can't actually repay anything, right? If Bob is only getting just as much income as he's spending, he has no money left to repay Mabel. The economy has shrunk. He can't repay. And so now we're back in circular flow. Now the arrows add up again. But notice they're adding up at much skinnier levels. And so at the real level, the household is in recession. At the real level that we really care about, because all those monopoly money, right, that's just pieces of paper. At the real level, we've got both Sally and Bob only working half-time, think of it that way, right? Representing, on average, some people being laid off, some people still having their jobs, and only buying half as much as they would ideally like to. Now, this can go on for a long time precisely because we're in a circular flow economy. This can just keep on, in principle, going on forever. We just are in a recession and we stay in a recession. There's nothing here to make it change. Except that eventually Sally will start spending a bit more, right? And this is what happens if you go through a very long recession with no government intervention whatsoever. Eventually people will start spending it again because, or at least a little bit more, because their car is now 20 years old and breaking down. They have to go and buy a new car at some point. Or other types of infrastructure just go down, and so somebody has to rebuild them. Spending starts to happen. And so if Sally starts spending a little bit more, then Mabel can start hiring a little bit more. And Bob can start repaying a little bit of his debt. Right now he's getting a little bit more income than his expenditure, and so he can start repaying the debt. Here he goes. But you can see it can take a very long time to get out of this, right? Great Depression, more than 10 years to try and get out of this hole. Is there a better solution? And by now you should know where I'm heading at, right? Act 2, enter Gus. Gus is the government, right? Actually, Gus was there all along. I just kind of kept him in the background. Collecting taxes from Sally and Bob. So they actually spent a little bit less on their private expenditure, right? Because they had to hand over some of their monopoly dollars to Gus. And then spending those taxes on what economists call public goods. So the kinds of goods, and this happens in households too, right? That private agents aren't very good at providing. So in the household, this might be the furniture. If you say, Sally and Bob, you need to buy the furniture, Sally would go, no, I don't want to buy the furniture. Bob uses it too. Why should I spend on that furniture? And Bob, of course, says the same thing. And so Dad comes in and says, okay, let me just collect some of your allowance and I'll buy the furniture. Right? That's public goods. And so that's been going on. And so all along we had this circular flow going on. Okay? But Gus's budget was balanced. He's not spending any more than the little bit of tax revenue he gets. Remember, we're in recession, right? So we're not getting a whole lot of tax revenue, and as a result, he decided not to spend a whole lot. But basically, all Gus's role is here is instead of Sally sending money directly to Mabel, she sends it to Gus, and then Gus sends it to Mabel to buy slightly different goods, public goods, rather than private goods. And similarly for Bob. Nothing really changes. Just the route of the money changes hands a little bit differently, but at the real level, nothing has changed. Sally is working for Mabel, Mabel is sending goods back. One day, Gus proposes a new idea. What if I start spending much more? Big fat arrow. on all those things in our house that need repairs. Because remember, when we had that family meeting, you guys all voted for a balanced budget and for low taxes. And so we've kind of let things slip a little bit, right? The furniture is getting ratty, the plumbing needs repairs, and we haven't really done that for a long time. So let's just start doing that. Why don't I start really spending and improving our infrastructure? Or I could spend not quite so much more and cut your taxes instead. But then you guys have to promise that you will spend those tax cuts. Right? And that will have exactly the same effect. Because I'm asking Mabel now to produce all those goods, right, to fix all the plumbing and to produce the furniture, Mabel will start needing to hire you guys full-time again. And so Mabel is now in balance. The big government expenditure and the skinny expenditure from Sally and Bob add up to full employment, where she's now hiring Sally and Bob full-time. And so Bob now, because he's being hired full-time, if he keeps up not spending so much, he can start repaying his debt much faster. But, says Sally, how are you going to pay for all that, Gus? Great idea. How is he going to pay for that? Sell bonds to Sally. I'll borrow from you, Sally, because now we're in balance again, right? Sally is getting her income from Mabel, a fat arrow of loan repayments from Bob, but still not spending very much. And so she can spend whatever she's not spending on private goods, she can send to Gus as loans. And in return, Gus will send her government IOUs, also known as T-bills. As a result, Bob pays off his debt much faster, watch the red pile shrink, but Sally at the same time is accumulating government IOUs. There we go. Once Bob is done repaying, doesn't have to repay anymore, he can start spending more again. Gus then stops borrowing, right? Why? He doesn't need to anymore. Cuts spending back to the regular level and raises taxes again. So his budget is back in balance. We're back in circular flow. The normal situation. This can go on for, again, a long time, forever in principle. And one thing I want you to notice here is, imagine this just going on forever. This is the government debt. It's just sitting there. Not hurting, not helping, it's just sitting there. One insight macroeconomists derive from this is the deficit doesn't matter. The level of the deficit doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have a really big pile sitting there or a skinny pile sitting there. It's just sitting there. What matters is if it grows. But as long as you just keep it stable, it doesn't hurt, doesn't help. And in fact, one thing I can't capture in this very simple story is real-world economies are growing over time, right? And so, in fact, this pile will become ever smaller relative to the size of this household economy. And so the deficit as a percent of GDP will actually fall, and so naturally become less important. But that's kind of a side note here. Eventually, Sally will eventually start increasing her spending, right? Maybe when she retires. When she starts increasing her spending, Gus can then step back and cut spending, and then he'll run a budget surplus, which he can start using to pay down the Gus debt. The end. And I want to end then with 3 questions that I'm just going to throw at you and see what comes back in the time we've got left. We still have about 13 minutes, if that clock's right. Yeah. So, actually, let me just put all 3 questions up, and then you can pick whatever you want to talk about. How was this household not like a regular household getting in debt? What was the key difference here? How is it fundamentally different in a way that politicians don't seem to understand? How was this household not like a corporation losing money in a way that politicians don't seem to understand? For example, by claiming that they are a great presidential candidate because they used to run a corporation. And how is this not a morality play? Anyone? Yes?
I have a question about your circular model. When you say government investment, investment necessarily means there's going to be a return. The government has made numerous bad investments. And you could put a list together and we could put them across Republican and Democrat. That's where I see the weakness in the model. And that's what I have trouble with in terms of government expenditure, is they don't make the right investments. And they're also now acting as venture capitalists, and they're not good venture capitalists.
I fully agree. I would add that not all businesses make good investments either.
That's not coming from taxes. That's coming from shareholders,
Yes.
which is a different ballgame.
Why?
Why? Because shareholders are private. They don't involve taxes. And that's a big difference.
Aren't we all shareholders?
A corporation's can go out of business, but government doesn't. That's the difference.
I'm kind of counting on people from the audience. I totally agree with you. I would say if you surveyed economists the way these studies that Mankiw cites do, 90% of economists would say, yeah, the government is very inefficient, makes all kinds of mistakes all the time, bad decisions. But economists also have this notion of, it's nirvana something, nirvana economics, where there's a tendency in the political debate to do one of two things. To say, if you're a liberal, to say, oh, all these firms is making all these bad decisions, and that's what got us into this financial mess in the first place, because they spent their shareholder dollars and put them into these subprime mortgages. We need a government to regulate and make everything perfect. So they're comparing a flawed market with a perfect government. And then the other side of the debate, the conservatives do exactly the opposite. And I hear a little bit of that in what you're saying, where you tend to say perfect markets compared to a flawed government. Right? Markets they have the right incentives. They're there to maximize returns to shareholders. That's all we need. Government always screws things up. I think the reality is both of them screw up.
Well, I don't disagree with that.
Okay, sure. Over there.
So the premise was that a stable deficit is not harmful to the economy. And yet if you look at the projections right now, we're at 15 trillion headed to 20-something trillion over the next 10 years. If government doesn't do something to halt that, then where does that leave us?
So that's a growing deficit.
That's what people are projecting.
Right. Yeah, actually, I was very, very careful, just depending on what questions, that I'd brought a whole bunch of slides that I can show you. There, that's what you're talking about. The federal debt, according to the Congressional Budget Office, right now is about 73% of GDP. The baseline projection right now, where baseline means the Congressional Budget Office has to, when it makes its projections, take current law as given. And just say, well, if current law is such, if this law is upheld, then this is going to happen to our deficit. And the projection is actually this is going to be falling. But the reason why, and part of this is, well, the reason why they also have this alternative fiscal scenario, and they started doing that in recent years, is that nobody really believes that current law is being upheld, right? And the big reason for why they also have this other scenario is they have this graph in their projection, right? That nobody really believes that the Bush tax cuts are going to be repealed at the end of this year, as current law says they should be, right? We really believe that most of them will be extended, which means the deficit will not shrink. And similarly, some spending cuts that are now in the works, right? Nobody really believes that they're going to happen. So the baseline has declining deficits all the way out to 2022. But we really believe that it's going to go up. And if it goes up, then the interest on the debt itself is going to add to the deficit. Yep. So we definitely, so again, all economists, remember statement 7, would agree we need to do something about that. We can't just let the deficit grow like that.
Back to your slide with the 3 questions, or how does this not relate to a government?
Yeah.
There was no one infirm, a child, or the elderly in that household. So there were users in the household who weren't contributors.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So if you had, say, a baby in there or an infirm elder, yeah, right. And so, but what conclusion are you drawing from that?
Well, comparing it to a government that, as we know, funds a lot of services for those who cannot contribute.
Right, so in a lot of advanced economies, rather than leaving that to households to fend with, it's become a public good where we say, well, we're going to pay for that through the tax system. Yeah.
Paying for things for which they do not get the same amount of contribution. Am I making this point?
That's right. Yeah. Now you're going to look askance at me and going, like, these crazy economists. I guess we would define that as a form of consumption, because we actually get consumption is anything you get pleasure out of, and knowing that your grandma is being taken care of, or knowing that your baby's healthy, is consumption. It's something that you're willing to spend money on, right? And you can either do that privately, or you can say, well, it actually was going to work better if I hand over my money to the government and then they pay for it. So in that sense, it is in my story, but it's very hidden.
Wouldn't another way to put that be to acknowledge that not all return on investment by governments is tangible, i.e., if you build a road, you're not going to necessarily get money back from it, but what you get from it is movement of goods and people that pays back society. Ditto with education, you may not get an immediate return on the fact that you taught your 6-year-old how to read, but eventually that 6-year-old becomes a 26-year-old who contributes to society.
Exactly. And that's why the key message I hope to get across is economists don't care about money. We care about the real stuff. And so and real stuff includes services like teaching kids or taking care of your grandma, right? So that's the stuff that we care about. And in fact, a very big reason for why we would argue in a recession you should keep the economy going is that, what has happened in recent years? Lots and lots of teachers have been fired, right, because of the recession. That is hurting our economy, the real economy, because we're hurting human capital. So we're hurting long-term growth. Our long-term ability to deal with deficits is being hurt if we don't deal with the recession by doing what it takes to keep the economy, to get the economy back up. That's the real stuff we care about. The rest is just money, just pieces of paper in the back.
Can you make a guess about how much more money the government should be spending now? Do you have any theories, ideas, graphs, charts?
This is where Mankiw or Krugman would immediately have a number, right? I mean, what Krugman, for example, and a lot of economists were saying at the time of the stimulus that it was way too small. And there was a whole debate in the Obama administration, right, which eventually people who saw the political side of it more than the economic side decided on this relatively small stimulus. And I've got, if you're interested in that, if there's more questions, I can show you slides about that. But the shortfall, the shrinkage of the expenditure was way, way more than $787 billion. And so they would say that the Obama stimulus, even though it helped stop the economy from its free fall, did very, very little to really get the economy going again, which is why it's been taking so long. It was way smaller than the shortfall. So basically, whatever the shortfall is, and it was on the order of $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion, maybe 3, it's on the order of 2. That's how big the government deficit should have been. The government expenditure boost should have been. Temporarily, in the back.
There's this whole concept of time built into the flow in the model in terms of length of time to recover from a recession, which to me is a very subjective perspective, should it take 3 years, should it take 5 years, should it take 10 years? How much money do we need to invest now to only make it 3? Is there any trend on average as to how long it takes to influx into that flow to shorten the recovery period?
My sense, just from my reading of history, is it happens within months. If once you do the thing, right, when the stimulus was spent, you immediately saw an effect, right? And the Great Depression is the great example of where essentially nothing was done. And 10 years later, we were still in a very deep depression until World War II happened and the government started spending a huge amount. In no time, we were back to the absolutely full employment, as full as it's ever been, and the economy was back up. So my answer would basically be do it right away, hit it hard, don't even wait. Because you're just hurting yourself. You're hurting the real stuff, the stuff that you care about.
Do you believe that recessions are inevitable in our economy?
To the extent that they're driven by Minsky moments, right? And that seems to be the story. And even the Reagan recession, which was purposely induced by by Paul Volcker, right, to try and squeeze inflation out of the system. Let me not go there. Most recessions are driven by financial crises, both in the US and abroad. And so I would say that this story is a very good argument for financial regulation because it's very often the financial sector that gets overexcited. I'm not saying we don't need a financial sector. We very much do. They provide a very useful role in society, but there seems to be this trend where things are going happily along. We really like having our financial sector, but then somehow, and every time it's a different way, right? The financial sector gets overexcited and starts lending more than is safe, and convincing themselves that this time is different. There's a book by two famous economists called "This Time is Different" that analyzes all financial crises, hundreds of them. Every single time the banking sector goes, "This time is different," and they get overexcited again. We get in a recession. So my answer to that question would be maybe not. It's if we have good financial regulation. The financial regulation was dropped in the Clinton years, right? And that, a lot of people say, is what got us into this mess.
So where does the Simpson-Bowles solution fall in all this?
To keep the deficit from doing this, we need to cut something, cut spending somehow, or raise taxes, increase leakages, or reduce injections. And they're just trying to decide what the best way of doing that is. And they've advocated a mix of everything, right? Some government spending cuts, some tax increases, and a heavy focus on cutting what they call tax expenditures, which are all these tax benefits we get that really are just government expenditures. If you have a deduction on your mortgage, that's really exactly the same as you paying your full taxes and then the government paying you, basically subsidizing your mortgage, right? And so my sense of the Simpson-Bowles plan is that they have that's a big part of their plan to cut these tax expenditures, which is a great way of cutting the deficit as far as I'm concerned.
One more question, Klaas.
Okay.
On where you were looking at leakages on your original diagram, it bothers me a little bit when you talk about consumption. What is that leakage understated to foreign countries? For example, anyone who goes into Kmart and buys a pair of imported jeans, that's consumption, but that's a giant leakage over there.
Yes, that is, imports are leakages.
Is that on the consumption side? How do you differentiate, or how do they differentiate between foreign purchased goods that are bought in the United States through a retail outlet?
Yes, so that is very hard, and that's exactly why they do this screwy thing. So it's quite easy to measure overall consumption, right? Overall sales. All these firms have to report their sales, overall investment, overall government purchases. But some portion of all three of those is actually partially from abroad, right? That very first part of the production process, or and so that's why we then look at exports and imports and say, well, we're just going to subtract 5% because that's the average import content, net import content, of all those consumption flows.
Well, then on exports, now how do you deal with financial instruments? For example, if you've bundled a lot of these sorry mortgages and you have shipped them on to an Icelandic pension fund, is that an export?
No, that's a
Financial product?
the service that the financial company, when it makes that arrangement, right, when it helps Greece hide its debts, that's a financial service that they get paid for, right? And so that's a service, just like a good or a service. And so that is an export, yes. And in fact, that's a big part of American exports, is those kinds of services.
But are they?
But the money itself is different. That's a different story. That's pieces of paper changing hands.
You mean if I have a $500 million bond that I'm selling it abroad, it's not a $500 million export?
No.
It's a...
It's the $5,000 that you were paid to arrange that deal. That's the export.
Okay.
We thank you, Klaas.
Welcome.